Welcome to this session entitled How to Include Diversity and Culture in Your Textbook and Other Academic Writing. Our speaker today is Stacy Kraft DeFreitas. Stacy is a licensed psychologist and has just moved from the University of Houston downtown to take a role at Prairie View A&M. Stacy earned her PhD in clinical psychology from Duke, and her primary research interests concern the academic and mental health development of youth, particularly urban youth of color. She focuses on strengths-based and positive psychology examinations of psychological phenomena and is the author of African American Psychology, A Positive Psychology, which won a TAA Most Promising New Textbook Award this year. So thank you very much for being here with us, Stacy, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you everyone for joining us. So note that most of this is relevant to academic and textbook writing, but there are some tips that are going to fit better in one area than another. As we go, make sure if you have a question, you can use the little raise hand feature on the reactions. That'll be better because you'll pop to the top and Mike will see you, or you can type your question in chat, and I'm fine with you doing that as we go along. I'm going to move a little bit quickly, but I will have the handouts available, and Maureen said she will share them on the TAA website, so those will be accessible to you as well. So let's get started. So my objectives here are to explain why we should highlight diversity in our writing, examine some strategies, some specific things that you can do to incorporate diversity into your writing, and then highlight a few things that you should make sure that you're avoiding. So why do we even need diversity in our writing, right? So first, we have to think about the consumers of our writing. The students are going to be so much better prepared for the global society that they're growing up in if they have been exposed to diversity throughout their schooling, right? So the more that they're exposed to issues of diversity, the more critical thinking that they're doing and processing, the better off they're going to be in the global society. And also when students see themselves in their textbooks, it opens this idea in their mind that this is an opportunity that I could engage in, right? They start to believe that they, as students, could have these careers that they're seeing talked about in their textbooks. And so it's really important that we start incorporating more diversity in our textbooks. This is really important because textbooks are really far behind in terms of diversity. Now they are getting better, but we found that for example, if you think about biology textbooks in terms of their diversity, it will take about almost 500 years for the diversity that's in the textbooks to match what's current in the student body of biology students, right? So they're making progress, but it's so slow that they're not going to represent how diverse their students are in these textbooks if they keep going at this pace. So we really have to move up the pace. And we know particularly like STEM textbooks are an area where there's a lot of area for growth. And we see this particularly with women of color. There are very, very few acknowledgments and pictures of women of color in textbooks. So it's biology, geology, all the STEM books are kind of leaving those groups out. And that means that those students are not seeing themselves as potential biologists and geologists. And that's a problem. And then finally, publishers and consumers are really looking for diversity in textbooks and other academic writing now. They're starting to really understand how important it is. And so as individual authors, we have to start kind of also thinking about the history of diversity in our own disciplines. So if you don't know kind of how much diversity is represented in your discipline, you should do a little bit of research and some background and look at the history to see, have there been any areas that are kind of problematic in your history? So for example, in psychology, Robert Guthrie wrote a book called Even the Rat Was White. And the book really looks at issues of race in psychology and thinking about how there's been this history of not recognizing people of color. So in your own disciplines, think about kind of doing a little bit of research and figuring out what's the deal with your field. So the first thing I would say in terms of if you want to start incorporating diversity into your writing, you have to consider your own worldview. because your beliefs will come across very quickly in your writing. And that's what people think, right? Oh, of course, they're going to know what I mean when I write things, but we get a lot of information from what you don't write as well, and the things that you don't address. And so it's really important that we start to consider our own worldviews. So how do we do this? There are a variety of things you can do, and we're going to kind of go through some processes. But like one example of something that I did when I was writing in my textbook, it was about African Americans, but I never used the term ethnic minority in the textbook one time, because I feel like it's not a term that's really useful for us, particularly in the United States anymore, to use the term ethnic minority. So I used people of color or something like that. So thinking about the terms and making conscious decisions about what you're doing and thinking about why you're doing those things is really important. So you have to consider ways that you can avoid being ethnocentric, right? Don't just push things that are particularly from your worldview. You're going to have to think about and open your mind to other possibilities and other worldviews. So a couple of considerations. One is to avoid colorblind ideologies. So a lot of people have this perspective that colorblind ideologies seem fair and equitable, right? So if I don't see and I don't acknowledge race, then what's wrong with that, right? I'm not disadvantaging anyone. But the problem is that for many people, their culture and their ethnicity is such an important part of their identity and who they are, that if you ignore that, you're ignoring a big piece of who they are as individuals. And also, if you engage in colorblind ideologies, you're also ignoring histories of oppression and discrimination and current oppression and discrimination that people are experiencing. So we can't take that perspective, even though a lot of people are like, no, it's the fairest way. It's really not the fairest way, right? And we have to be able to meet people where they are. Okay. Now, one idea that I really like to think about in terms of examining your own personal worldview, because sometimes people haven't done that, right? And you know, it's not a process everyone goes through. But there's a phenomenon called cultural humility. That is a really important idea. That's basically a combination of cultural competence, which I think most people know about what that is, right? This idea that you have knowledge and understanding of various cultural groups, but it's not just cultural competence. Cultural humility includes basically this self-awareness, this search for understanding of your own worldview and how you fit into the world. And if the more cultural humility you have, the better you understand you and your perceptions and your understanding of the worldview and how that works with other people, right? So it goes a little bit deeper than, okay, I know about this culture. It's I know about me and how I see the world and how I will interact with this culture. So it requires a lot of introspection and consideration of your own cultural belief system and how that's going to impact your interactions with others. So some of the key things to think about is, how does you valuing or devaluing certain culturally based ideas impact your writing, right? Do you believe that your cultural values are superior to others? And can you respect the values of others even when they are opposed to your values? Like, these are some deep questions that many people may not have asked themselves or really thought about. So this is kind of a form of self-awareness. It's about your own emotions, your values, your goals. And there are various assessments out there that you can do to examine your own cultural humility if you haven't done that. And they can usually be found pretty easily with a Google search of cultural humility assessment. And there are various ones. Right here, I put a resource on the slide for the Project Ready, Reimagining Equity and Access for Diverse Youth. This is an online training that was actually created by librarians, and they have a module on cultural humility, which is a really nice place to start if you don't have a lot of knowledge about it, as there's some education and it has links to assessments at the same time. Okay. So with this idea of cultural humility, not only do you do this kind of self-reflection, but it does help for you to learn about other cultural groups as well, right? So you need to do that in various ways. reading, right? Reading articles, books, watching documentaries, podcasts are really useful ways to get information. Everybody has a podcast. If you want to learn about something new, you can definitely find a podcast on it these days. And then I also recommend joining a diverse writing or research group, because that's a place where you can really start talking about these ideas. And if you're in a diverse space, it's an opportunity to do some learning and growth as you're working on these ideas. So using cultural humility is really not just likely to improve your writing, but also likely to improve your research as you start to think really more deeply about your place in the world and how you relate to others. And that's going to impact how you communicate with others and those things that you consider. So let's start with some specific suggestions, right? So here I'm going to start focusing on some very specific examples, but I'll only be giving you kind of one or two little bits of advice since we don't have a lot of time. So we'll start a little bit by talking about language. So I know many of you have probably thought about this a lot. There's so many different terms for various ethnic groups, right? When we have seen that there's, and I've only put a few right up here for various ideas. But you really need to make sure that you're doing some research about the terms that you're using and know why you're using them. So for example, in my textbook, I differentiated between the use of African American and Black. And I included kind of in the forward or the introduction, a discussion of why I did that. And you may want to, like in an article, you may want to do this in a footnote or something like that, kind of discuss the reasons for using it. But for me, and for many people, when they talk about African Americans, they are talking about Black people who have roots in the United States since the time of slavery, right? And those people often identify as African American. But if you're talking about someone who's Black, this is a more encompassing term, right? So you're talking about people from Africa, potentially Caribbean Black people, Brazilian Black people. So it's a much broader term. And so it's important to be precise and to really think about the terminology that you're using. And if you're not sure, right, then you do your research first, right? Before you start doing the writing. In terms of gender, I think I've offered kind of a few ideas or tips. One idea is using the singular they or their. I know this is something that's kind of a newer idea and some people are not comfortable with it. So instead of using he or she, using they. And I would push you or encourage you to consider using it all the time. Like don't even think about it, just put they and sit with it. It's singular. Okay, I know that's going to be very difficult for some people, but there does seem to be a push for this change. And then you don't have to worry about the gendered language or the issue, right? I'd say avoid gendered language as much as possible. Like when it's appropriate and it's necessary, then use it. But when it doesn't matter, then don't use it is the idea. So for example, don't say boys and girls, say children, right? Because this puts people who don't firmly identify as girls or boys in an uncomfortable position. They feel in a way called out by their absence, right? And so you have to say things like children, don't use mailman, use mail carrier, those types of things. And I think another area where we are really just beginning to talk about in our academic writing is the transgender population. And we have to make sure that we're not just leaving people out of the conversation. So if an issue touches the transgender population a particular way, you should make sure you're addressing it or thinking about it. I know that there isn't as much research on this population, so it's difficult. So, but for example, if you're discussing issues like homelessness or mental health treatment, many would think, yeah, sure, we'll talk about the transgender population, but they should also be talking about this population when they're writing about family or romantic relationships, because these are issues that are going to be particularly unique for this population. So it's important to kind of think about those ideas and include them as well. In all honesty, Probably the transgender population is one that I don't know that much about, but I recognize that, and I seek information, and I'm growing. And I think that's like the most important tip I would say for everyone here is to recognize that no one's going to know everything. But if you're coming from a place of trying to educate and trying to include, trying to include a diverse population, then it kind of comes through, right? This effort to make, basically your effort to make an effort. Another idea for sexual orientation is to make sure that you're not assuming heterosexual is the default. In most academic writing or most things, we expect that if it doesn't say anything about sexuality, the person is heterosexual. And we should probably move away from this stance, right? Because it others members of the LGBTQ plus population. So if you plan on addressing sexuality, for example, in your case studies, when you're writing, don't just write it for people who aren't heterosexual, right? Make sure you're writing, you're including sexuality in all of your case studies, because we don't want it to seem that, people aren't in the default category. So now we have to bring it up. Okay, so a lot of this section looks specifically at visuals, and it applies probably mostly to textbooks, but also applies to kind of course materials that you might create for your class, so like slides and other things as well. So one area where I think that we could really improve in terms of visuals is increasing our addressing ability levels, right? And so people who are disabled or differently abled are often not going to be represented in our textbooks unless we are specifically talking about those issues, right? And we have to remember that people who have different abilities are also experiencing all the other things that we're experiencing, right? They have families, they have relationships, they have jobs, right? And so leaving this population out is problematic. Another area where you can use visuals is when you're talking about religion. And so we know that I think it's the same idea as for ability, right? You don't want to just include pictures of religiously diverse people if you're talking about religion, right? The idea is to include these images when you're talking about things that maybe have nothing to do with religion, right? That have to do with family or school. Like, can you show a child in a traditional religious garb in a school as you're having discussions about school? We make like these conscious choices to show a diverse world, I think will be really beneficial to our textbooks in the long run. Some other visual considerations. One is skin tone. This is particularly important for if you're thinking about like medical or biology journals or texts in beauty, showing a range of skin tones. This has been an issue that's been particularly brought up in dermatology, where medical doctors are graduating from school and not having a good understanding of what certain skin issues look like on darker skin. And so if we have to start kind of thinking about these types of issues and including these pictures and these texts, these pictures in our text. Also, I wanted to also have us start thinking about the pictures of the experts that we have in our textbooks, right? So we often have pictures of scientists or specialists in our field, and a lot of times they're white men, right? Most of these pictures are of white men. And this is something that's showing up a lot of times in STEM and other areas. But we know we have experts that are much more diverse, right, than this. So we need to make conscious efforts to show pictures of people who are experts that look like the range of students who are going to be reading these books. So for example, here I have a picture of Margaret Beale Spencer, who is an expert on adolescence of color. And if I have an adolescent psychology book, I should have a picture of Margaret Beale Spencer in it, right? I should be talking about it and talking about her. So just really thinking about those ideas. And then for some of these images, a lot of them you can get for free, right? And you can get them for free. But for others, you would have to pay. for them. But TAA does have grants that you can apply for to help pay for some of these types of images. And I'm sure many of your institutions have grants to pay for them as well. So money shouldn't be the factor that keeps us from including these images in our text. Okay, so let's kind of move towards thinking about some final, let me see time. Okay, some final considerations. Other things that, other diversity issues that we don't talk about a lot are one, body size and shape. I think this is an important area that we can include. And it doesn't have to be, as I said, when we're talking about things like being overweight or eating disorders or anything like that, let's just, as a practice, show more variety in body size and shape in our textbooks. Also age, right? We shouldn't just show older people in our textbooks when we're talking about age issues. So just kind of breaking ourselves out of these molds. And then also remembering the fact that a lot of ability issues are not visible. And so making sure that we're including these things when we're talking about case studies or other issues. And so basically just trying not to ignore these other important issues that many people in the United States population are dealing with. And then another idea I kind of want us to think about is this idea of social justice. I know a lot of people may not consider themselves social justice activists or anything like that, but really by making some of these small changes in your textbook, you are engaging in social justice, right? You are making people visible who haven't been visible. You're giving them a voice. And that's a really, really important message, I think, for us to send. And for some, I think it may feel outside their comfort zone or not what they typically do. But I think that there are some ways that you can kind of do it strategically. And I'll show you a couple of examples towards the end that might help. Another consideration is who you cite in your textbook. Are you citing diverse experts in your field? Think about if you're covering topics that are relevant to marginalized groups, are you only sticking with mainstream groups in terms of what you're covering and talking about in your book? And then I think really case studies are a really wonderful way to interject diversity into your textbook writing, right? Providing diverse examples, basically telling stories in those case studies that really help your students understand the life experiences of someone that they may never meet, right, or come across, but it gives them a new worldview, a new way of thinking about the world. And so let's talk very quickly about what to avoid. One, the first thing I'll say is failing to fact check. So right here, this image is a picture from a nursing textbook. And you may not be able to read it, but it basically has a lot of things in it that are not true. The goal of it is to talk about cultural differences in responses to pain. However, these were not things that were derived from research in any way. People just came up with them, I guess. I'm seeing some freaking out. Maybe you're reading them. But like some of the examples are, Indians who follow Hindu practices believe that pain must be endured in preparation for a better life in the next cycle. Blacks often report higher pain intensity than other cultures. They believe suffering and pain are inevitable. Jews may be vocal and demand assistance, right? These are problematic ideas that are found in a textbook. So make sure you do your fact checking and that you're basing your ideas off of research before you put them in your textbook. The other thing is you make sure you're not using a framework that marginalizes your readers further. So meritocracy, right? This idea that everybody's equal, everybody has the same opportunity is a problematic view that can be very difficult for many of your students. So avoid those types of ideas. Not calling out oppression in any way, like for example, if you have a history textbook and you're talking about the Trail of Tears, how could you, don't just factually discuss it, talk about how horrendous it is, right? And why it's problematic and what we could learn from it today. And, and talk about the things that that have come from that history. And so I think that it's really important for us not to just, completely say, oh, I'm writing a textbook, I'm just going to completely give you the facts. Yes, that's true. But you also want to make sure that you're making connections for your students so that they see that the history is currently impacting our everyday reality. Also, I would strongly recommend that you don't discuss diversity in just one chapter. Sorry. Because that idea really makes people feel like they need to be boxed into one group and they don't apply, what their experience is doesn't apply to other areas. So that's problematic. So make sure you're addressing diversity throughout your text. This is just one example from my textbook of something that I did to address diversity. So this table looks at myths about same gender loving the African American community. So it's basically gay and lesbians. And basically it's just the myths that people believe followed by facts and then references at the bottom, right? To show you that these things are based in research. And this is a very simple, easy table that I interjected into the text. And I didn't really spend a lot of time talking about in the book, but it's an important piece of information for the students. Another thing that I did, though, even though some people would say that my entire book was about diversity because it was about African Americans, I wanted people to recognize there's a lot of heterogeneity within African Americans. So inside each chapter, I included what I call this section called individual issues to highlight some of these differences. So here you see ones focused on sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, but I also have these focused on gender, skin tone, religion, and other factors. So for many of you, something like this in your textbook may be a good way to start in terms of interjecting diversity into your text, because these are just little call outs that apply to the main issue of your chapter. And you can always get a writing partner to assist you with these, right? This doesn't have to be necessarily what you produce on your own, but you can always make collaborations with someone to assist with these types of ideas. So takeaway messages: consider your own worldview and how it impacts your writing. Educate yourself on topics particularly relevant to your discipline. Create a plan for how you address issues of diversity in your writing. Gather resources that you can refer to when engaging in writing, and then participate in diverse writing or research groups. Okay, so those are kind of the things that I would say to take away from this. And so as we close, I want you to consider this quote from Tolstoy: recognize that changing yourself is changing the world, right? And so this is how we start making these differences, right? As individuals making conscious choices to do something different. Okay. All right, and that is it.
Wonderful. That was really good. Stacy, thank you. Yeah, let's give her a hand. I think I want to first acknowledge that there was a very lively set of comments and back and forth in the chat, really valuable, and that will come out in I have a chat transcript, so I can share that with you later. There were two questions that I wanted to acknowledge and raise to you in case you have quick comments on them, but I suspect they are bigger questions than we will be able to cover in the remaining minute that we have. But let me at least acknowledge those questions. The first one was from Peggy Lumpkin, who, just give me a second to get back to it, who said, how do you combat current efforts to stop critical race theory, for example, in Texas, to stop discussions of it, I think.
Right. How do you do that? Well, we could do a session just on that.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people are really conflating critical race theory with accurate discussions of history. And so if you actually let people know what critical race theory is, it's not being taught in K through 12, probably ever, because it's something most students don't even get in college. So yeah, I'll just say that.
Yeah, I mean, that I think that's a great question, Peggy, and we should come back to it and have further discussion.
I'd be happy to discuss that further.
Yeah. And then Jocelyn Nelson asked regarding the canon in the arts, she's in music, How can we reframe the white European-centered canon in our textbooks? And how can we answer some colleagues pushing back who are afraid we're canceling or throwing out the white male great composers?
Yeah.
Another big question and an excellent one. Do you
That,
want to comment on that?
you know, that's a whole nother session. But I think that's a really important idea. And I think there are some fields where it's going to be harder than others, right? And I have to admit, like, I love classical music, and I think it would, and I don't know how much diversity there really is in it in terms of what we still have access to today. And so I think that if you have resources that say, yes, there is valuable, I guess if you can find some people who have produced music that are not the normal white European male, even I think even finding a female composer is almost impossible, right? At least for the classics. I think if you can find some good examples, then show them as much as possible, right? Expose your students to them as much as possible, and have discussions with your students about why things are the way that they are.
Great. I think you're right. We're just tip of the iceberg here. We're just touching on things that both really important questions, and I thought fruitful, quick responses. Thanks, Stacy, for doing that. There are many thank yous also in the chat. So
right, and feel free to email or reach out to me, and I'm happy to continue the conversation further.